Because humans possess an intrinsic worth and shouldn't be treated like play toys to manipulate at our wills. I stand with the resolution and believe that human cloning should not be allowed and be banned for the safety of all. Now, before we get started, let's kick things off with this resolution. If human cloning passes this test, go ahead and I value this coffee mug because of its ability to hold coffee and for me to drink it. I don't value a human for anything they give to me. I value humans because they are simply. Very simple. This is the basic reality itself. We value humans simply because they are, or we use them for whatever we want. Now that we know the test, let's show how cloning absolutely fails this test. And we'll explore this through looking at two separate kinds of cloning that are discussed in scientific literature. But first, let's kind of discuss the process that cloning works as. So to create a human clone, what you must do is you must take DNA and then put it into an egg which has had the nucleus removed from it. Fertilize that egg in order to create an embryo. Now, once you create that embryo, you're faced with two choices. Let's jump into the first kind of cloning, which is research cloning. And my problem with research cloning is very simple. It's that it enables mass murder. If you're taking notes, write down mass murder. What research cloning does is it takes that embryo, then it kills that embryo, takes stem cells from it, uses those stem cells to develop tissues and organs for research on disease and things like that. Now, you may be thinking, oh, that's fine. It's not a human yet. But that's not true. According to Dr. Shanabati, if I'm pronouncing that right, from the Nature Cell Biology Journal, they did a test where they took an embryo, removed it from the womb, gave it the nutrients needed to survive, and saw if it could become a human or not, or a fully fledged adult. And they found that even without outside resources, with those nutrients, that embryo possessed everything it needed to become a fully fledged adult. That means it has everything needed to become an adult inside of it. It's just in an earlier stage of development, which means that killing an embryo is akin to killing a 2-year-old and taking their limbs and using them for research. It's just that we don't see embryos, so we view it differently. It's obviously not okay, and that's why human cloning must be banned. Let's look at the second kind of cloning. You can write down as reproductive cloning. Now, this is cloning the way we normally think about cloning. This is Star Wars cloning, right? It's when you create a fully fledged adult and use them for their own will. My problem with this is that it again views humans as means to an end. You create this human the way you want them to be created, and then you value them because they provide you with that. You can create a blonde human because you value the trait of blondness. You can create a human who's strong because you value the trait of strength. This exploits people and treats them as means to your own end and manipulates them as playthings to conform to your will rather than people who are worth something and ought to be treated. Vote against cloning and vote against mass murder and exploitation.
Okay, first I'd like to thank Drew for offering being willing to speak with me, and for QallOut for enabling this debate to take place. Let's begin with his first idea, the idea that the test that humans are human simply because they're human. Really, let's think about it this way. What is a human, really? Is my arm a human? No, my arm is not a human. Having an arm is not a necessary nor a sufficient condition to be a human. An arm is merely a biological part of me. Same with any part of my body. It is a biological part of me. What is necessary to be a human is up for debate. Many different societies, many different cultures have a discussion about what is a human. For example, is AI a human? Would a synthetic intelligence be human? Is an in vitro test tube a human? Though we've really answered that last question with an affirmative yes all across the world. Let's begin with his second idea, the idea that Wyatt fails in his contention. Namely, he's talked about two different kinds of cloning. The first is research and the second is reproductive. To be precise, there are I'd like to clarify this a little bit more. We're talking about the three different kinds of artificial cloning: gene, reproductive, and therapeutic. Reproductive is exactly what he talked about, an entire copy of someone. Therapeutic cloning is one that produces embryonic stem cells for experiments aimed at creating tissue to replace injured or diseased tissues. And then gene cloning is the most interesting because this is a very different process. It does its own entirely different thing. So let's talk about what cloning actually is. Is cloning growing a whole person, or is cloning merely growing parts of a body? It could successfully argued, I believe, that cloning is both. Cloning is both, for example, regrowing my skin cells and also just making a new me, as odd as that would sound. Cloning is literally taking one part of a piece of a biological structure and then recreating that identical same biological structure in another form. So more importantly, cloning is made out of two different kinds. There's embryonic cloning and adult cloning. Stem cells, regardless of whether they're drawn from embryos or adults, achieve the same function, namely copy and pasting parts of a biological process. So just to say that it's merely embryos is narrowing the issue. However, second, he talks about humans are an ends to a mean, or like means to an end, treating humans just as things. I would argue that we do this all the time for basically everything. We are always looking to what is the best means to blank end. That's what we strive for. That's what we try to achieve. We try to achieve the best end possible and try to go with the most efficient and the most moral methods of reaching that end as we see fit. Cloning is the best means to an end, but what is that end? The end, I would argue, for both of our sides is the benefit of humanity. Which side benefits humanity in the end? I would argue that my side benefits humanity more in the end, because with cloning, not only can you reproduce someone's limbs, but you can also enable someone to have a child, for example, if they have some genetic disease. You can also avoid mutations in the process.
Okay, let's take a look at arguments here. First, we have an argument under the test of humans as ends rather than means, where Eric tells you that benefiting humanity is how we should view this, and that we view humans as means to an end all the time. My response to this is ignore this for morality. I can't just go up to a human and say, hey, because I really want to be rich, I'm going to slap you in the face and take all your money. Obviously not, because I treat that human as somebody worth something, so I don't assault them for it. We don't treat humans as means to an end. We treat all sorts of other things as means to an end, but humans are worth something in and of themselves, and Eric ignores this completely and says, no, humans aren't worth anything at all. We view them as means to an end for the benefit of humanity, which is almost circular in a way. So we still need to be viewing humans as ends rather than means in and of themselves, or else we're throwing them to the side. Eric enables slavery under this argument because he says, hey, humans are only worth something in as much as they provide us with something. It's not what works. Let's go ahead and jump into the rest of it. He said there's three kinds of cloning: gene, therapeutic, and reproductive. First, therapeutic and research cloning are the exact same thing. They're just used under two different titles sometimes. So apply all the arguments under research cloning and mass murder for the embryos under the therapeutic argument. Let's talk about gene cloning. Gene cloning isn't human cloning. Gene cloning takes a very specific part, and as Eric very eloquently said at the beginning of his speech, this arm isn't human, right? This is just my arm. If you take a gene, you aren't cloning a human. And the resolution says human cloning should not be allowed. We're not talking about gene cloning whatsoever. Or else, under Eric's own interpretation, which made a lot of sense, we would be talking about arm cloning or leg cloning or something like that. It's not human cloning. And that's Eric's own logic he brought to you in the beginning of his speech. Under reproductive cloning and different things like this, he says they can still benefit humanity and we don't have to kill people to do it. First, he doesn't disagree that embryos are humans, so we can assume he agrees with this point. It just says, well, we don't necessarily know exactly what is a human, but offers you no analysis or really any basis for what it is. So right now, the only logic that says what is and what is not a human is on the pro side of the debate that says, hey, a human is something that possesses all the qualities to develop. Just like a 2-year-old isn't a fully fledged adult yet, we don't think they're not human because they aren't a fully fledged adult, right? We still feed them, we still treat them like humans with dignity and treat them as ends rather than means to an end. And so let's wrap up and take a look at the whole debate. He says, well, we can gain all sorts of great things from cloning. So under this point, I have one response here, which is no proven success. Proven success. No progress the last 6 years in we're refusing to invest more money in progress. The scientists actually researching cloning as a viable way anymore. There's no benefit. And even if there was a benefit, we ignore cloning because it murders an embryo and then treats humans as ways that we can design them according to our own wills. Humans are worth something. Let's not forget that.
There's a couple of interesting points I'd like to bring with. I'm going to be actually working back from front because that's the way my notes work. Let's begin with the idea that you're murdering an embryo. The idea of adult stem cells hasn't been brought up at all. Inherently, when you're dealing with adult stem cells, you're dealing with not an embryo. I think that is very much obvious. An adult stem cell is one that you can totally take and transform and still build a clone from of a thing that is part of a human body, but is not itself human. Let's begin with the next go with the idea that no scientists are working on. This is just absolutely completely false. According to the Human Genome Project is working on it, the as well as many different universities, along with, oddly enough, the Oregon Health and Science University. In 2013, they were the first to use cloning techniques to successfully create human embryonic stem cells. So inherently, we have this idea where the idea that scientists aren't working on it at all is just completely false. Scientists are still making progress. Just because one doctor said, oh, we don't have anything going on, doesn't mean that other scientists agree. Let's begin with the next idea of no proven success. I'd like to point out there was no proven success in generating electricity until eventually Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla decided to actually go and generate it themselves. Someone has to eventually discover something that works. Just because there's no proven success for a technology now doesn't mean there won't be no proven success in the future either. But my second point is there has been proven success. We have been able to clone other things. We've been able to clone sheep, for example. We've been able to clone livestock. In fact, most of the cows you eat these days, or at least a large portion of them, are probably cloned as well. Just because something is difficult to clone does not mean it's impossible to clone. Scientists agree that it is difficult to clone humans, mostly because our genetic makeup is inherently complex. This does not make it impossible or even wrong to clone them just because it is merely difficult. Now let's look with the idea that I think that humans are a means to an end. I disagree with this. I think that humans are the end themselves, but we also inherently treat ourselves as means to an end. For example, I'm in college. It's very difficult and stressful, and to be honest, I get headaches because I'm doing so much work. I'm inherently temporarily putting myself through a bad condition in order to reach a good one in the future. The idea that inherently this leads to slavery is inherently antithetical because slavery is itself a very degradation to humanity. Treating someone as inherently an object is very bad. But let's begin with the idea that an embryo is a person. The idea that an embryo, that I agree that an embryo is a person. I do agree embryo is a person. I am pro-life. But inherently, let's ask this question, is there other ways to do cloning other than embryos? Yes, we've actually seen these techniques in other forms, such as adult stem cells. Just because it's an embryo does not mean it's impossible. More importantly, just because again, we have this idea that just because there might be, for example, if I decide to clone an arm, that is human cloning. But nor is an arm inherently wrong. An arm is not part of a human, but it is considered human cloning. So I think at the end of the day, it's very clear that just because there's some difficulty, that doesn't make it wrong.
Okay, so let's talk about the idea around, let's talk about the idea that there's different ways to clone rather than human embryos. Eric tells you that you can use adult stem cells, but what he ignores is the fact that here's the process of cloning. According to the Center for Bioethics, they explain this in the article I'd be happy to post afterwards. What it essentially says is you grab DNA, you insert it into an egg that has had the nucleus removed. Then you take that egg, fertilize it, it grows into an embryo, becoming a human at the earliest stage of development. And then from that embryo, you extract the stem cells. Now, there's no way you can just take stem cells and then clone them. That's not the way it works. It has to grow inside of an embryo, and then you take the stem cells and clone them. You can't just, go onto my arm and say, I'm gonna grab some stem cells, grab them and clone them. That's not the way cloning works, and that's not scientific. Now that we've decided that, the impact here is that all cloning murders. That's the impact. If you're cloning for research, which is what Eric is kind of talking about, and it's kind of been the focus of our debate, is research or therapeutic cloning. Essentially, you're murdering an embryo in order to solve disease or different things like that, which is inherently wrong and views humans as means to an end, as objects, as Eric eloquently put it, rather than people in and of themselves. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at this argument that that cloning is possible and will help us. First, he says just because one scientist said it doesn't mean it's true. Well, it's actually not just a scientist, it's the chief executive of Human Genome Sciences Incorporated, who says policymakers continue to enthuse about therapeutic cloning, even though the majority of scientists no longer think it is possible or practical to treat patients with cells derived from cloned embryos. They've already moved on to investigating the alternatives, end quote. And that's, again, from the Center for Bioethics. Now, he goes on, so what we see here is that scientists essentially have abandoned this and have moved on to alternatives because they recognize that it is a failure and that it's impossible to do correctly in the majority of cases. Why? Well, he says, we've cloned animals successfully. Well, here's the thing about cloning animals. Again, according to the Center of Bioethics, 97 to 99% of the time, that fails. In fact, cloned 277 times they tried to clone that same sheep. In order to move on. You want to take that scientific method, that testing of whether this works or not, and apply it to human embryos? That's 277 dead humans. That's 97% to 99% of the time humans die for research. This isn't a world we can walk into, and it absolutely shows why cloning cannot be allowed.
Let's begin with the last point. The idea that inherently cloning is like it doesn't work. Consider, for example, the light bulb. For example, cloning right now is a very new technology. We've only been doing it for a couple of decades. The light bulb, again, was a very underdeveloped technology before it was perfected, or even as much as you can perfect a light bulb. And there were many failures. But let's look back to the idea that inherently cloning is murder. Let's say that someone decided to clone an arm. Like, let's say that I lost this arm and I decided I want a new one, so to begin the process of cloning my arm. And the arm dies. Is that murder? I would argue that it is not murder. It is my arm. In the same way, stem cells inherently, are those in fact a person? I would argue that it is not. Stem cells can form anything they wish. Or let's take, for example, or it inherently isn't not necessarily a person. Well, let's begin with this idea that inherently cloning is murder. Again, let's look to a site from Eurostemcell, which specializes in stem cell-based cloning. In therapeutic cloning, which is the one we're mostly talking about, the basal cyst is not transferred to a womb. Instead, embryonic stem cells are isolated from the clone basal cyst. In other words, what they're doing is they're taking it from it. They're splitting it apart. At this point, all they're doing is just replicating stem cells fertilized embryo. This is hardly murdering a child, for example, or murdering a 2-year-old. This is merely taking stem cells and reproducing them within an effect. Sure, the technology doesn't exist there to mass produce this, as unfortunate it is. I think we'd all like the idea of being able to regrow an arm, for example, but it just simply isn't there. But let's look to the idea that inherently it's being abandoned. It clearly isn't being abandoned. If you just do a Google search, you'll see plenty of scientific papers talking about the development of technology. Sure, one guy who's the CEO of a major corporation said, we will no longer pursue this. That's excellent for him. It's the free market at work. But many other scientists are also doing it, including the site I just mentioned, Eurostemcell, along with many others. This development is still in process. More importantly, let's look to the idea that humans are a means to an end. I do not believe this at all. Humans are not inherently a means to an end. Humans are the end themselves. And what we do with ourselves is that means to an end. We inherently do difficult things in order to reach that final goal. A stem cell is hardly a human. This must be understood. A stem cell, just because it has the potential to develop into a human, is not itself a human. For example, my nutrients that I consume in food do have the potential through a long circuit of routes to eventually become human. Does that mean that the nutrients are human? No, not at all. Just because it has the potential to become human does not mean that it in and of itself is human. We both agree that doing horrible things to torture humans is wrong. We both agree with that. But what we disagree is what constitutes a human, and more importantly, whether or not it's worth it in the end. I think it is.
Okay, I want to ask you a question and then pass the mic, see if you can answer it. So talking about this idea where you said you take the stem cells and then insert them into the egg and then wait till eggs fertilize. Do they grow inside of the embryo and then you extract them for the cloning?
Grow inside of the embryo and then extract them? No, what happens is that the embryo is inherently like its own thing. Like what happens is that it grows and then so I guess, yes, they are grown in the embryo and then extract. It's at like a very early stage of the process, no more than 2-3 days in. If that was the question. Okay. More importantly, the idea that, okay, good. More importantly, like this is like, again, 2 or 3 days in, it doesn't happen for very long.
Sure. Okay. Now, we both agree that an embryo is a human life. You said so yourself, and I think that's what you agree with. And so what you're saying here is that you insert the stem cells into the embryo from someone else's DNA that you're trying to clone. And then once the stem cells are inside that embryo, you extract them to create the tissue or the organ that you're trying to clone. What do you do with the embryo afterwards? That person, that embryo that we both believe is human life, is killed. And you say it's only 2 or 3 days in. That's great. A 2 or 3 day old human should not be killed. That's what we have to remember here. If we both agree that an embryo is a human life, which is what you stated throughout the debate, then the process of human stem cell research and stem cell cloning, as you put it, is murder. That's the huge issue here. Let's come to the rest of the arguments you bring up. Under here, we talk about how just because 99% of the time it fails is because technology hasn't improved, like the light bulb. Let's remember, Thomas Edison did fail thousands of times before creating the light bulb. But the difference between that and cloning is that every time cloning fails, every time Thomas Edison failed in a light bulb, it was no big deal. He was like, oh, I'll just buy a new light bulb. But every time cloning fails, that's a dead person. When Dolly the sheep was cloned, there were 277 failures before it was perfected. That's 277 dead sheep. We take that process and we try to test human cloning, that's 277 dead people, which is why we can't allow human cloning. So the next argument you make, we talk about how the embryo, you don't have to kill an embryo to clone, but we've already seen how you absolutely do throughout your own analysis. Then we move on and you say that there's still scientific benefits because just one guy said he wasn't going to invest in it. My response in here is majority of scientists. The quote came from the chief executive of the Human Genome Sciences Incorporated, who says, quote, the majority of scientists no longer think it is possible or practical to treat patients with cells derived from cloned embryos. So on one side of the debate, we have an executive director of Human Genome Sciences Incorporated, someone who looks into this and researches this, saying that the majority of scientists don't think this is going to work because every 97 to 99% of the time it fails, and that seems to be very intrinsic to the process of cloning itself, versus you have a couple people who say, hey, we're still kind of looking into this. Both of these things can be true. The two people you quote can totally say, hey, yeah, we're still looking into this. While the chief executive of Human Genome Sciences Incorporated can be correct in saying that the majority of scientists are not looking into this because it fails. So at the end of the day, cloning doesn't offer us any scientific benefits. And even if it did, you would still vote against it because every time you test cloning, you're murdering an innocent person.
All right. So the question now becomes, is cloning itself a murder of an innocent human being? I would argue that inherently you're going to see that inherently it's a risk that we have to take. For example, consider the polio vaccine. When it was newly being developed, many people agreed, I'll vaccinate my children against polio. What they didn't expect was that the number of polio deaths actually increased because, again, it was untested and it was new, but we still decided to vaccinate anyway to perfect the technology. More importantly, what about the lives that can be saved as a result of cloning? This hasn't really been touched upon. I'd like to bring this up now. Imagine, for example, that someone had a needed a new heart and they were going to die soon. So instead of so we just clone them a heart and we place it in. Now, Drew might come back in the next speech and argue that's just trading the life for a life, or even worse. I would argue, however, that inherently that inherently right now the technology is such that we need to require embryos. There's already been some motion within the scientific community to eventually get to the point where we just clone stem cells themselves that will not require an embryo and is in fact still human cloning. We need to remember that right now cloning is a very new science. It's only been a couple decades, and hopefully soon we'll be able to see some lasting change, so some more permanent change in other areas. But right now, it's not. It's inherently a new technology. Let's look to the idea that the majority of scientists disagree. I'd like to point out the majority of scientists didn't think man would ever be able to fly. The idea of a flying machine was considered ridiculous until in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a series of inventors, the most famous of which are Orville and Wilbur Wright, decided to, hey guys, guess what? We can fly. For a majority of scientists to dismiss a new technology so soon after it's created, as we've seen, there are still quite a few scientists working on this. More importantly, I like to look at briefly. It said the majority of scientists have decided to pursue other alternatives. Alternatives to what and for what? Alternatives of stem cells for what? Human cloning. This is what this guy does. It's what his company is designed to do. Alternatives to what? Are we looking at alternatives to say fix a heart in other ways? What is the end result of this? Is this just alternatives to stem cell cloning in general, or is this alternatives to finding another way to eventually clone? Finally, let's look at this last idea that, again, there's no proven successes. Of course, there's no proven successes. Stem cell technology is very new, but eventually we hope to grow it so we can stabilize the process.
In this debate have really come down to. The first key issue here, the issue again of murder. So let's take a look at Eric's arguments under this point. Eric says, hey, it's a risk we have to take. That in and of it treats humans as means to an end. to an end of societal improvement or human benefit. Says human embryos, that's a risk we have to take. I don't think it is. Killing humans is never a risk we will have to take. Now, let's go on here. He says, well, we can do stem cell technology, but he gives you no analysis on how, even under that stem cell technology, according to his explanation of it, you take the stem cells, put them into an embryo, allow them to grow, extract them, create your tissue and organ. What that does is then you have these stem cells and then you murder the embryo. You murder that developed person, which we have both agreed on. He has not offered you any opposition argument on this. We both agree that that embryo is a person. You murder that person after you take those stem cells. And he says, hey, we might be able to go into this. No, or and move past this. This is the intrinsic process of cloning somebody. What you have to do is take those stem cells in order for them to grow into fruition, into a way you're allowed to create those tissues and organs, extract them and clone them. They absolutely have to be inside of a human embryo, which means that you have to kill that embryo in order to clone. Murder is intrinsic to cloning. They can't be separated. It's going to be ever feasible. As we've talked about, 99% of the time it fails, and every time it fails, a human is murdered. That's the biggest issue here. And then maybe it'll work someday. The majority of scientists disagree. He says, well, the majority of scientists said we couldn't fly. Okay, well, great. Then let's just go ahead and throw out all scientists that we've been talking about here. He's referenced scientists himself. No, we can trust these scientists. Sure, scientists are wrong sometimes, but that doesn't mean we just throw out all evidence. What we're going to do here is we're going to side with either the majority of scientists on one side or Eric saying, hey, sometimes scientists are wrong. I agree. It doesn't mean we should throw them out. At the end of the day, murder is intrinsic to the process of cloning, and an opposition vote is a vote for mass murder. And it's a vote for mass murder based on no benefits. But even if there were benefits, it wouldn't be worth it, because humans are ends in and of themselves rather than means to an end.
Okay, let's begin with the last idea, the idea that humans are not means to an end. Intrinsically, we treat everything as means to an end. And this point was completely unaddressed. The idea that we are ourselves means to an end. For example, a means to an end. I'm putting myself through college. It's rather torturous, but I'm still doing it. Inherently, we treat everything as means to an end. But in this case, both Drew and I share the same end goal. The end goal of both of our sides is humanity. We both seek that end goal. We both seek the better world, not the idea that mass murder is bad. Now let's look at this idea that humans are mass murder. Recall what we're doing, how stem cell works. What you're doing is you take an embryo, you grow it for a couple of days, and you remove the stem cells that are formed as a result of that. If that counts as murder, then pretty much everything involving hurting myself counts as murder. For example, if I were to scratch my arm, I would kill part of myself. That would then inherently be murder. But more importantly, the idea that inherently there was benefits, namely the fact that we could regrow internal organs for people who are injured, we could regrow arms for people who lost them. That entire side of the issue has been swept under the table. The number of societal benefits are rather immense. Let's look at them. For example, there's amputees, there's people who have to deal with heart surgery and other issues. There are many issues that are involved within cloning, many positive benefits. We can, even if someone was in a terrible accident, we could completely transform their lives back to the way it was before. But more importantly, the idea of the majority of scientists disagree. My one response is that inherently for any new technology, the majority of scientists will be unlikely to adopt it. It is a new technology. Let's look, for example, for vaccines. They weren't popular at all. In fact, many people said that they were, in fact, a very bad thing, as I mentioned earlier. But a vaccine has been shown to have many positive benefits. And speaking of vaccines, let's look to that final idea that I brought up the last time I spoke, the idea that people died when vaccines were used. Vaccines, the research, for example, for polio began in 1935. In the first test cases, many people died. And until Jonas Salk perfected the polio vaccine, and even then some people died as a result of those initial test foyers. When dealing with any technology that directly affects humanity, you're going to see people, unfortunately die. So either way on the side of the issue, for any technology, you're going to see this. But more importantly, let's look at the societal benefits that society will reap.
Okay, so my opponent has conceded this huge point, which is that no matter what happens, humans will die. Make sure we understand the magnitude of what he's saying. He's saying mass murder is okay as long as it provides us with some benefits. That's absolutely incorrect. He says that we didn't address what the benefits are in that That's not true. What I said was these benefits are hypothetical. He hasn't offered you any proof they could ever happen versus what I said, which was the majority of scientists disagree it's possible. The majority of scientists can be wrong. Sure. One side we have the other side we have Eric. I know what I'm voting for. And so at the end of the day, we see Eric's advocating for mass murder for the benefit of science. I'm not.
All right. Okay. Okay. So at the end of the day, I'm not advocating for mass murder because I do not because I inherently see an embryo at 2 to 3 days to not be mass murder, as I've mentioned earlier.